My name is Melissa Sharp, and if you'd asked me 5 years ago where I saw myself by 32, I would have said something like leading a product innovation team. Living in a downtown apartment filled with sunlight and mid-century furniture, maybe even mentoring women in tech. I'd worked hard for it. I did everything by the book, or so I thought. Instead, I'm sitting in my tiny rented studio in Seattle, drinking chamomile tea out of a chipped mug, with a severance email still starred in my inbox. 2 weeks ago, I was laid off from a startup I helped build from scratch, no fault of my own, just strategic restructuring. And I still haven't told my family. Not because I'm ashamed, but because I know what they'll say. Scratch that, I know what he will say. Elliot. My older brother. The one who walked into every room like he owned it, and often did. The kind of man who wears tailored blazers to family barbecues and corrects people's grammar at weddings. He's the definition of a success story, at least according to my parents. Stanford grad. Tech executive. Founder. Investor. The kind of guy that strangers ask for LinkedIn advice. Me? I was always the artistic one. The sensitive one. The helper. I got my degree in human-computer interaction instead of something real like software engineering. I liked design. I liked people. I cared about user empathy, interface flow, accessibility. Things that mattered to me, even if they didn't look flashy in a job title. But to my parents, to Elliot, it never quite counted. Growing up, I was the one who stayed late to clean up after family dinners. The one who remembered birthdays, who made playlists for road trips, who comforted Grandma Ruth when she cried the first Christmas after Grandpa passed. I was there when she had her first stroke. I was the one who took unpaid leave to drive her to physical therapy. Not Elliot, never Elliot. He sent flowers once. And yet, every time we were all together, he was the one who got the spotlight. My mother, Colleen, once said, "Melissa, you're such a good girl, you've got such a big heart." Which was code for, "You'll never be the star, but at least you're kind." My dad, Jonathan, rarely weighed in on family dynamics. He was a tax attorney, the quiet type, who spent more time with his spreadsheets than his children. He loved logic, not emotion. And with Elliot, he saw himself disciplined, driven, sharp. With me, he saw, I don't know, a complication, maybe. And, still, I tried. I always tried. To prove myself. To be enough. Even when I wasn't sure who I was proving it to anymore. Which brings us to this year's Easter dinner. Grandma Ruth insisted we all come. She was recovering well, sharper than ever. And she said she missed seeing everyone together. So, we showed up. All of us. The whole dysfunctional Sharp family circus. The dining room smelled like rosemary and lemon, and sunlight filtered in through the lace curtains. Grandma's long oak table was set with the good china, the silver, the folded cloth napkins none of us knew how to refold once we used them. The roast lamb was perfect, as always. For the first hour, it was pleasant enough. Small talk, wine, stories about my cousin Maggie's new baby. Elliot dominated the conversation, of course, regaling everyone with a story about negotiating a merger deal while hiking in Tahoe. My parents beamed. And then, it happened. Just as Grandma was reaching for the carving knife, Elliot leaned back in his chair, took a sip of wine, and looked right past me. "You know," he said casually, "not everyone can handle a real career in tech." The room fell silent. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. Every eye turned to me. Some confused, some smug. My cousin Ben smirked into his glass. My mother gave an awkward chuckle, as if she wanted to smooth it over. My father looked down at his plate. And Elliot? He didn't even flinch. Just took another sip, like he hadn't just lit a match and dropped it into the middle of the table. I sat there, stunned. Trying to swallow the lump in my throat, the burn behind my eyes. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, the hum of embarrassment in my chest. But I said nothing, not yet. Because at that moment, something shifted. Something subtle but powerful. Grandma Ruth, who'd been silent through the whole exchange, looked up sharply. She set the carving knife down, her eyes moved from Elliot to me. And in that instant, I saw it. The decision. The one none of us could have predicted. And that, my friends, was the first ripple. If you've ever been the one overlooked, underestimated, the one who kept showing up even when it hurt, this story is for you. Because sometimes, it takes just one moment, one look, one truth finally spoken aloud to change everything. And trust me, everything was about to change. The moment Grandma Ruth lowered her carving knife and her eyes locked onto mine, I felt a swell of emotions: relief, fear, courage, and a fierce intuition that this Easter dinner would not end as it had started. I could no longer sit silently in the wake of Elliot's jab. My throat tightened, and for a heartbeat I thought I might choke on my own defiance, but then, drawing in a slow, steady breath, I found my voice soft, but steady, like a whisper turning into a roar. "I'm sorry, Elliot," I said, voice wavering as I leaned forward. "Did you mean to suggest that real tech is beyond my capability? That I don't belong at this table?" Laughter erupted from my cousin Maggie and her new husband, but Grandma Ruth raised her hand, slicing the noise like the crack of a gavel. "Elliot," she said, her tone measured but unyielding, "you owe your sister an explanation." His grin flickered. He set his glass down, careful, deliberate, then looked at me. "Okay, Mel, let's be honest. You've worked in design and user experience. Cute, soft things, not hard tech. That's not my insult. I just don't think user-friendly interfaces pay the bills out here." Every syllable felt like a branding iron across my chest. "Pay the bills," I repeated, voice trembling. Funny, that's exactly what I was doing until 2 weeks ago when the strategic restructuring swept me out of my job. But, Vinay, go ahead. Tell us why I don't belong. My mother cleared her throat and looked at Elliot, then at me. "Could we not have this conversation now?" "Oh, Mom," he replied, "I'm just clarifying a fact." That was it. That moment when I recognized his words weren't about clarity at all. They were a strike, calibrated to land, to cause exactly the level of hurt I felt in that freezing room, full of polite smiles and veiled looks. I stood up, chair scraping against the hardwood floor. It echoed louder than any shout. "You want clarity?" I asked, my voice breaking through the tension like a sudden storm. "Let me give it to you." I turned to everyone seated around the table, searching their faces for even one flicker of real interest, empathy, even simple human curiosity. I saw surprise had they realized this was my life they were sitting on, as though this were some theater piece he was performing for their benefit. "And this," I said, turning back to Elliot, pointing at the empty space between us, "used to be my seat. Until now." I leaned forward, finger trembling. I wasn't laid off because of some lack of capability. I was collateral damage in a hostile takeover. I launched the product's MVP ahead of schedule. I designed the architecture for user flow based on intense empathy research. I saved millions of dollars in potential churn when I argued for accessibility features we hadn't budgeted for until I demonstrated it could reduce litigation risk. But your idea of real tech doesn't include any of that, does it? My father shifted in his seat. My mother's cheeks flushed pink. My brother looked torn between boredom, irony, and annoyance. Grandma Ruth's eyes poured pride into me, but I hardly could take in her support, because I was racing to say long-hidden truths into the sudden silence that was swallowing us. "What is real tech, Elliot?" I asked, stepping around the table and standing tall by the window, the mid-afternoon sun illuminating my face like a spotlight I never asked for, but needed more than ever. "Is it algorithms? Is it code, AI, cryptic backend work? Is it only the stuff that your bubble accepts as high? And if so, why?" Because the world cares about usability, and empathy in design it shapes how millions of people experience products and companies, and yes, it saves lives. I paused, fighting tears that burned like acid. "But hey," I said, voice catching, "maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I've been too soft. But being soft the way all of you keep calling me is what got me fired from a job I loved. while you dismissed it like it was a hobby. The room sat still. My words had landed. My brother opened his mouth to speak, but it wasn't the performative chuckle or shrug I'd expected. He looked unsettled. I swallowed the lump that made my throat ache. And if you're wondering, Elliot, why didn't you just say that 2 weeks ago? I didn't because I thought you'd take me seriously as your sister. I thought I had your support. I thought that this family. I swept my hand to include everyone could see beyond the shimmer of title and stock options to what actually matters. Work, heart, integrity. Now I felt something shift. A tightening of muscles around me, like we were all standing on a stage suddenly lit by truth. My mother set down her water glass, fingers quivering. "Melissa," she whispered. Grandma Ruth stood slowly, the table groaning under the weight of the moment. She moved toward me, placing her hand on my shoulder with a firmness that made me feel both 12 years old and 32 all at once. "That's enough, Elliot." Her voice was ice calm. "Melissa is our daughter, granddaughter. I will not have you tear her down like this." Elliot's jaw clenched. He swallowed, eyes flicked to Dad, then back to Grandma. For a moment, it seemed he might retreat, but then his arrogance surfaced again. "Fine," he said. "Let's just say I want the best for this family. I didn't mean to upset anyone." "Maybe you do, and maybe you don't," I said softly. "But wanting the best doesn't give you the right to dismiss my work, my pain, or my place." I saw Elliot's family dog pad into the room, as though watching from the sidelines. I bent and scratched her ears, drawing in her warm presence, the only comfort I felt. I straightened, turning back to the room. "I'm applying to new jobs, I'm rebuilding. And I'm not asking you to support me by pity or apology. Just by recognizing that I am enough by seeing the work I've done and the person I am. Not the one you want me to be." Silence anchored the air. My father cleared his throat. My mother's eyes glistened. Maggie grabbed that empty seat and reached for my hand. "You're amazing," she whispered. Cousin Ben nodded seriously. Elliot kicked the chair and stood quickly. "I've said my piece." He caught his coat and turned toward the door. "Enjoy the rest of Easter." He didn't look at me as he walked away. The slam of the front door echoed. The room exhaled with him. My mother scrubbed her face with trembling hands. My father swallowed so hard he lifted his Adam's apple. Grandma Ruth released a long breath and pulled me into a hug that felt like it tried to hold both of us up. That was the moment it shifted. The moment my truth entered the light and drew blood. That was the beginning of something that would cost us all more than a tense holiday dinner. A few hours later, only Grandma and I sat at the table, candles lit, lamb cold, only the tea between us. She passed me a printed email I'd typed earlier, titled "Severance and NDA," with red underlines around key clause non-disparagement, a gag order that prevented me from speaking about internal details, including layoffs. "Remember this," she said, voice thick with care. "This is the chain that keeps you quiet." Ollie. I looked at her email with fresh eyes, seeing not just legal words but symbols of the power that silenced, the legal power, social pressure, family standing. Grandma squeezed my hand. "They can't silence you forever, Melissa. But they can try to use fear. Use this meal, these words." Her eyes bore deep. "You will have to decide what you owe yourself." That night, I lay awake on crumpled sheets, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment. Elliot's smirk, Grandma's look, my own defiance as I stood and spoke. My phone buzzed with one message from my best friend Clara. "You did what you needed to do, proud of you, but you okay?" I tapped back, terrified, but more alive than I've been in years. I stared at the screen in the dark, the words glowing back at me. Alive. That felt strange, scary, necessary. And yet, the fact I had chosen truth over silence it had already begun to change the course of things. You would think after speaking my truth at Easter dinner, after standing tall in front of my entire family and calling out the subtle cruelties and suffocating dismissals I'd endured for years, that I might feel victorious. even a little vindicated, but the truth is, I didn't feel strong or brave or empowered in the hours and days that followed. I felt exposed. Like I had peeled off layers of carefully constructed armor in a room full of people who didn't know what to do with the naked version of me. No one called the next day. Not my mother. Not my father. Not even Elliot. The house was quiet, save for the occasional vibration of my phone on the windowsill, which lit up with an Amazon notification or a news update, but not a single message that said, "Hey, are you okay?" Or, "We're proud of you for speaking up." And I don't know why, but I kept checking it anyway, hoping for something that would tell me I hadn't just lit a fire and been left to burn alone in its glow. I cleaned the apartment twice. I reorganized my bookshelves by color, then again by genre. I replied to every job application follow-up email with obsessive politeness, like if I could just be helpful and pleasant enough, someone would finally say, "We see you, Melissa. We want you." But no one said it. Not even my family. Especially not them. By the third day, my mother finally sent a messaging, not a call, just a text, and it read, "Let's not make this a bigger thing than it has to be. Elliot's under a lot of pressure." He didn't mean anything personal. That message cracked something in me. Not because it was cruel, exactly, but because it was so heartbreakingly familiar. The same rhythm of defense, the same cadence of dismissal, the way she bent herself around his feelings and stepped over mine without a glance, like I was a rug that had grown inconvenient. I didn't reply. I think deep down I knew if I replied, it would become another loop of me being the reasonable one. The one who absorbs and forgives. The one who calls after the argument to make things right while the other person sleeps peacefully, believing they were never wrong to begin with. I went for a walk that afternoon, the sky painted with thick clouds that felt like they could press down on my head and crush the breath right out of me. And I walked past cafes where groups of friends laughed and shared stories over coffee, and I wanted so badly to feel that lightness, to belong somewhere so fully, to be seen without being judged or measured or pitied. I sat on a park bench and called Clara me best friend since college, the one person who knew my whole story without the family filter, and when she picked up and heard the silence in my voice, she didn't ask me what was wrong. She just said, "I'm here," and I cried. Not loud sobs, but the kind of quiet weeping that comes when you realize you've been carrying pain so long it's etched into your muscles. And only now is your body remembering how to let go. "I feel like I don't belong to them anymore," I whispered. Clara didn't hesitate. "Maybe you never did. Maybe you were always just trying to fit into a mold they designed without you in mind." I hated how true that felt. Growing up, the Sharp household didn't run on affection or acceptance, it ran on metrics. You were valued by performance, by grades, by scholarships, internships, promotions, engagement rings. Every family gathering was a quiet competition. Who was winning life, who was ahead, who was falling behind. And somewhere along the way, I started to think that love had to be earned through proof, that my worth was tied directly to the number of boxes I could check in. Now that I'd lost my job and dared to speak out against their golden boy, I had failed their unspoken test. Grandma Ruth called me that evening, her voice gravelly but warm, like a fireplace lighting after a long chill. "I just wanted to hear your voice, honey," she said. And for a moment, I felt tethered. "I think I messed everything up," I told her, biting the inside of my cheek to keep my voice from shaking. "No," she said firmly. "You didn't mess up a damn thing. You stood up for yourself in a room where they were used to you sitting quietly. That unsettles people. But it doesn't make you wrong." I let her words sit in the silence between us. She was the only one who called me Melissa and meant it as a name, not a label. The only one who didn't speak to me in comparisons. "You know," she added, "I've been watching this family a long time. And I see how they treat you. It's not fair, it never has been. But you don't owe them silence just to stay close." That stuck with me. Because I had always believed that silence was the price of love in our house, that if I swallowed my pride and kept my head down, they'd keep a place for me at the table. But maybe that table was never set for me in the first place. Maybe I'd been invited just to keep up appearances, not because I was truly seen. The next day, I opened a new email draft addressed to my parents, and I stared at the blank screen for nearly an hour. I wanted to tell them how hurt I was, how forgotten I felt, how their refusal to acknowledge the truth left me bleeding in private while they polished Elliot's image like silverware. But I knew they wouldn't hear it. Not really. They'd deflect, minimize, remind me to not take things so personally. They'd try to make it about tone instead of content. So I didn't send it. Instead, I wrote it for myself. I put every word I wished I could say into a folder I titled Truths Unsent. And as I closed the file, I felt something shift, not closure, not peace, but a step toward understanding that maybe being excluded wasn't just something done to me. Maybe it was a painful but necessary part of waking up to the kind of love I deserved. The kind that didn't make me feel like a shadow in my own life. The thing about being quietly disrespected, over and over again, is that you start to question whether you're the one imagining it, whether the cuts are really there or just faint bruises you've convinced yourself are wounds because you're too sensitive, too soft, too unwilling to move on. But disrespect, I've learned, rarely arrives with fireworks. It arrives like frostbite, numb at first, and then suddenly devastating. The day after Easter, my mother called not to apologize, not even to acknowledge what had happened, but to ask if I could please not tell anyone else about my job situation, especially Aunt Louise. Because you know how she gossips, and it might come off as unstable. That word unstable hung in the air like a wasp, buzzing with implication, and I bit down on my tongue so hard I tasted blood because I realized she didn't even ask how I was coping. Her concern was about appearances, about keeping up the image of the Sharp family success story, and anything outside of that narrative was to be hidden, filed under personal or unspoken, like a disorder no one wanted to claim. I told her, calmly, that I didn't need her to manage my story, and she went quiet for a long moment before saying, "I'm just trying to protect you." In a voice so laced with guilt, it felt like a trap. But that was only the beginning. Within a week, I found out through Maggie, not directly, that my brother had been invited by my father to speak at a regional legal tech summit he was co-chairing, and that the whole family was attending to support him, including Maggie, Ben, and even Clara, who had somehow received an invite to network with corporate attendees. I wasn't just left out of the event, I hadn't even been told it was happening. And that omission hurt in a way I hadn't anticipated, not because I cared about the summit itself, but because it confirmed something I'd long suspected but never wanted to believe, that I wasn't just excluded from family traditions. I was being systematically pushed out of the parts of our family identity that were tied to pride, legacy, and opportunity. I called my dad not to fight, but to ask him, as calmly as I could, why no one had told me. His response was so measured it could have been scripted. "We didn't want to put pressure on you while you were between jobs. We figured it might be awkward, given everything." Everything. Everything meant my moment of honesty. My protest. My refusal to be ridiculed in silence anymore. "You figured it would be awkward," I repeated. "So you thought it was better to pretend I didn't exist?" "That's not fair," he said, the defensiveness already coating his tone. "It was just a matter of timing. And besides, Elliot's presentation is directly related to corporate AI Lowies, an obvious fit." I didn't reply. I couldn't. Because I realized in that moment that fairness had nothing to do with how they made decisions. It was all about comfort, and I had made them uncomfortable, so they removed me from the narrative. And as if that wasn't enough, the next week, I received a legal document in the mail, wrapped in a thin blue folder with my father's law firm's insignia on the cover, and inside was a draft proposal from the family trust regarding Grandma Ruth's estate. Something I hadn't even known they were updating, and to my complete devastation, I saw that Elliot had been named as primary executor, with financial control delegated to him. Given his experience in technology and investment. I read the clause 3 times, blinking against the rising sting behind my eyes, and when I called Grandma to ask her about it, she was livid. "I didn't sign off on that," she said immediately, her voice sharp and cutting through the line like a blade. "They said it was just a revision, that nothing would change, just cleaning up language, but I never approved that." "Okay. And for the first time in my life, I heard anger in her voice that wasn't directed at city council or outdated bureaucracy. It was directed at her own son, my father, and at Elliot, who had taken advantage of her trust while smiling at her across a Sunday roast. It was betrayal, plain and simple. We pored over the documents together the next evening, spread across my kitchen table like fragments of a broken promise, and as Grandma read aloud the financial clauses, her hands trembled not because she didn't understand them, but because she did, because she knew the language too well and could now see exactly how carefully it had been twisted. They gave him discretionary control, she muttered, shaking her head, which means he could technically withhold disbursements to other heirs if he claims it's in the trust's best interest. She looked up at me with eyes that carried decades of both clarity and heartbreak. And you're listed as a secondary. No explanation, no clause guaranteeing equal access. Nothing. I didn't cry. Not right away. I just sat there, numb again, thinking how injustice doesn't always arrive as an explosion. It sometimes arrives as a paper with your name reduced to a footnote, signed by someone who once taught you how to ride a bike. And then came the text message from Elliot, the cherry on top. Hey, just wanted to give you a heads up about the estate stuff. It's nothing personal, just about streamlining decisions. Hope you're doing okay. I stared at it for 10 minutes, the casual arrogance of it radiating from the screen like heat from a stove. Nothing personal, he said. As if disinheriting someone wasn't a personal act. As if erasing my stake in the legacy I had fought for, cared for, lived for wasn't cutting something sacred out of me and tossing it aside like an afterthought. I didn't reply. Because there's nothing left to say to someone who doesn't see you as equal, who doesn't even see you as competition, just as an obstacle they've already cleared. And that night, as I sat under the soft glow of my kitchen light, the documents still open, Grandma asleep on the couch with a blanket pulled to her chin, I realized that this wasn't just about me feeling excluded anymore. This was war. And I wasn't going to sit on the sidelines and let them write the ending to a story they never asked me to help build. After the documents, after the summit, after the text that was more insult than explanation, something inside me that had been quietly bruised for years finally stood up, bloodied and tired, yes, but with a strange clarity. A defiant light that flickered awake, even under all the disappointment. And I realized I was done waiting for someone in my family to hand me recognition like a ribbon they could choose to pin or withhold depending on whether I smiled right way or stayed silent long enough to be convenient. I wasn't going to ask them for permission anymore, not for space, not for acknowledgement, not even for fairness, because that door had been closed too many times, and every time I knocked, all I got was a tighter lock and more reasons why I shouldn't be upset by the sound of it. So I did what I've always done when the world shrinks. I built something. I took every part of the project I'd been forced to leave behind in my old job, the research notes, the design principles, the user advocacy frameworks that had saved that product from a PR disaster, and I began to draft my own case study. Not for revenge, not even for validation, but because I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy, that my work had mattered, that I could take something discarded and hold it to the light and show the world that it had been beautiful all along. I spent nights sketching interface flows again, mornings writing narratives, revisiting feedback logs, crafting a story around what we had built, not as a failed team, but as a meaningful moment in tech that had been ignored because it wasn't glamorous or algorithmic or built to impress venture capitalists in Patagonia vests. And when it was finished, when the case study looked like something real and polished and powerful, I didn't just file it away. I started submitting design blogs, to tech publications, to conferences that had once ignored me when my title didn't shine bright enough. And slowly, something strange started happening. People responded. Design leaders shared my article. UX professionals reached out to say thank you. One woman wrote to me, "I showed this to my boss when I needed to explain why inclusive design isn't optional. You gave me the words I couldn't find." Another said, "This made me cry. You reminded me why I got into tech in the first place." And I cried too. Because it was the first time in a long time that I wasn't just tolerated, I was heard. Not through the filter of family politics, not through the comparisons I could never win, but through the simple truth of my work, my effort, my voice. I told Grandma Ruth everything, and when I showed her the emails, the reposts, the little wins piling into a mountain I hadn't dared to imagine for myself, she took my hand and said, "See. They tried to tell you what was valuable, but you knew all along." Auzek. Her faith in me was a bomb, and yet even with all that good beginning to unfold, even as new job leads began trickling in, and I started working with a nonprofit that was redesigning an app for survivors of domestic violence, I couldn't shake the ache that lingered every time I remembered that no one in my own family had acknowledged what I'd done, not even once. They hadn't read my case study, or, if they had, they hadn't said so. My mother was still posting curated photos of Elliot at panels and smiling beside him at tech galas, using hashtags like #ProudMom and #SharpLegacy while I existed in the margins, liked quietly by a few distant cousins but never once shared by the people who were supposed to be proud of me first. And it's a strange kind of grief, to build yourself from rubble and still long for applause from the very hands that threw the first stones. But I guess that's the trap, isn't it? Wanting recognition from those who never truly saw you to begin with. Still, I kept going. I redesigned my portfolio, joined a mentorship group for women re-entering tech, started guest speaking on virtual panels not to prove anything anymore, but because I finally believed in the story I was telling. Because I finally knew what it meant to lead without needing a spotlight to feel like I mattered. And somewhere in all of that, the ache didn't vanish but it dulled. Because I had stopped trying to be their kind of successful and started becoming my own. It wasn't the silence that hurt me the most, it was the way it began to bend, shape-shift, evolve into something colder, something sharper, a silence that no longer felt passive but purposeful, like a room that's too clean, too neat, hiding the mess under layers of polite cruelty. And I realized that while I had been finding healing in the outside world, within the walls of my own bloodline, something darker had been brewing. It started subtly, like most escalations do. I noticed it first in the group messages, the family chain where holidays were coordinated, where Maggie shared baby photos and my mom sent updates on Grandma Ruth's health, only now I wasn't just left out of planning. I was strategically bypassed, left unread when I contributed, my messages sitting there like ghosts among cheerful plans for a 4th of July barbecue that no one had told me was happening. I texted my mom directly. "Hey, just wondering about the barbecue Maggie mentioned?" I didn't see any details in the thread. She responded 4 hours later. "Oh, we figured you'd be busy. You've been doing so much lately, your work is really taking off. Let's catch up another time?" Another time. Always another time. Always an excuse draped in flattery, always a pat on the head where there should have been a seat at the table. I wanted to scream. I wanted to believe her. I wanted not to care. But I did. And then the real confrontation came, not over text, not by phone, but face to face, when I drove down to Portland to help Grandma Ruth sort her finances and found Elliot already in the living room, sleeves rolled up, laptop open, talking with Dad about optimizing estate liquidity, like it was a venture capital pitch instead of our family's future. They didn't expect me to be there, and it showed. Elliot's smile was thin, clipped at the edges, and my father didn't look up until I spoke. "Was this a scheduled meeting?" Elliot leaned back slowly, eyes scanning me like he was calculating how much damage I could cause. "We've been trying to make sure everything's in order while Grandma's still sharp," he said. "Didn't think it required a full committee." "She asked me to help," I replied. Grandma, bless her, nodded. "I told Melissa weeks ago I needed a hand. I thought I'd made that clear." Elliot shrugged. "It's not personal. We just didn't want to complicate things with too many voices." Too many voices. That was what I'd become, a noise to be managed, a variable to be minimized. I looked at my father, but he didn't meet my eyes. "We're just making sure things are legally sound, that's all." Legally sound? I echoed. Because changing beneficiaries and shifting control behind someone's back sounds more like strategy than security. That got Elliot's attention. His tone cooled. We're trying to avoid unnecessary disputes, Melissa. The more cooks in the kitchen, the more chances something gets burned. Funny, I said, stepping forward, heart racing, because from where I'm standing, it looks like the kitchen was locked the minute you decided my input didn't matter. There was a beat of silence, then Dad finally looked up, and his expression it wasn't anger or guilt, but something far worse. Fatigue. Like he'd already decided I wasn't worth the friction. We can discuss your concerns through the proper channels, he said. The proper channels? I asked, blinking. Are you serious? But they were. They always were. Because in their world, the law was a wall they could build and hide behind, and I was just supposed to knock gently and wait until someone felt generous enough to let me in. The rest of that afternoon passed like slow poison. I stayed because I'd promised Grandma, because she needed someone who saw her as more than a signature, and while Elliot and Dad pored over tax documents, I sat beside her, quietly reading through her notes, trying to decipher where she'd been cornered and how much they'd already moved without her full consent. Later, in the kitchen, she touched my hand. I'm sorry they make you feel like this. You don't need to apologize, I whispered. I do, she said. Because I see how they talk to you when you're not in the room. I see how they rewrite the story before it's even done. And I realized then that the wound wasn't just Monet, it was hers too, watching her legacy become a chessboard, her children and grandchildren pieces in some performance of success that stripped away empathy and replaced it with polished resentment. That night, as I drove back to Seattle, headlights washing the freeway in blurred lines, I cried not out of weakness, but out of fury, out of exhaustion, out of the sheer weight of having to fight, again and again. Just to be seen, to be trusted, to be counted among the people who bore my name. They weren't just cutting me out of inheritance. They were cutting me out of belonging. And the worst part was they thought they were right to do it. There are days when grief doesn't arrive as tears or rage or loud declarations of loss. It arrives quietly, like a fog that seeps through the cracks in your windows and wraps around your chest until you can't tell if you're suffocating or simply disappearing. And for me, that fog rolled in 3 days after the confrontation at Grandma's, when the weight of everything I had tried to hold together finally slipped from my grasp like wet glass shattering on tile. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, breath caught in my throat, my heart pounding like a warning bell, as if my own body had grown tired of pretending I was okay, tired of holding in the storm that had been building since the day my brother made that smug comment over Easter dinner, since the first moment I realized my family saw me as an afterthought rather than an heir, a guest in the house of a legacy I had helped nurture but was now being quietly written out of. I sat on the edge of my bed, hands trembling, trying to remember the last time I felt safe, truly safe in the presence of my own blood, and I couldn't. All I could recall were the moments I'd dimmed my voice to keep the peace, the times I'd shrunk myself just to stay close, the holidays where I was the one behind the camera, never in front of it, always the one cleaning up plates while Elliot passed around business cards and fielded questions about IPOs and equity, like he was the star of some glossy magazine spread the rest of us were just set dressing for. And now, all the silence, all the backhanded kindness, all the calculated omissions had converged into this one unbearable truth. I didn't have a family, I had a system. And that system had decided I was surplus. It broke me. That morning, I didn't shower. I didn't eat. I sat in the living room, surrounded by unopened mail and job listings I couldn't bring myself to answer, and I stared at the same unread email from Elliot, the one he sent weeks ago about streamlining decisions, and for a full hour I hovered over the reply button, not because I had something to say, but because I needed him to know he'd hurt me, needed someone to see that I was bleeding even if it was only through a screen. But I didn't send it. Because what would it change? Instead, I called Clara and let the phone ring 5 times before hanging up, because I couldn't bear to hear her kindness. I knew it would break me open completely, and I was already in too many pieces to survive the flood that would come with someone telling me I mattered. I wandered into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, spilled half of it on the floor, and didn't even wipe it up. It sat there in a pool, reflecting the morning light like a mirror too honest to look into, and I stared at it until my legs gave out and I sank to the floor beside it, knees to chest, forehead resting on my arms. That's when I broke. Not loud, not cinematic, just a low, keening sound, like something being exhaled that had been stuck for years. I cried for the girl who had tried so hard to be useful, for the woman who had rebuilt herself only to be erased again, for the daughter who was never enough and the sister who was always too much. I cried for every version of myself that had been shaped by their indifference. And in that lowest place in the cold kitchen tile, wrapped in the silence of rejection and the ache of being unwanted, I started to wonder if I'd ever feel whole again. If all this fighting was even worth it. If maybe, just maybe, they were right to cast me aside. That thought was the darkest one of all. Because for a moment, just one, I believed it. But even in that moment of despair, even as I lay curled beside spilled water and unanswered messages, something deeper than pain whispered back. Not hope, not yet, but memory of Grandma's hand on mine as she said, "You knew all along," of Clara telling me she was proud, of the stranger who emailed to say my words had helped her speak truth to her own team. Those fragments kept me from sinking completely. They didn't lift me, but they tethered me. Reminded me that outside of the echo chamber of my family's contempt, I did matter. I had value. There were people who saw me. And as the hours passed, and the light moved across the floor and touched the edge of the spilled glass, I forced myself up not with strength, but with necessity. I wiped the water. I drank what was left. I sat down at my desk, opened a blank document, and wrote one sentence. I refused to be erased. It wasn't a plan, it wasn't a manifesto, but it was a beginning. And that was enough to carry me through the rest of the night. It's strange how clarity doesn't always arrive with light or calm or even logic. It sometimes comes burning, blistering, wild, like a fever that sweeps through every inch of your body, tearing down what you thought was stable and revealing, underneath the wreckage, a version of yourself that was there all along but too patient, too quiet, too goddamn forgiving. And for me, that fever came on a Tuesday. 2 weeks after the kitchen floor and the breakdown, and the moment I whispered I refused to be erased into a document no one else would see, because that Tuesday, Grandma Ruth called, her voice tighter than I'd ever heard it, and she said only 3 words. They forged it. At first, I didn't understand. I was making tea, my phone wedged between my shoulder and ear, trying to balance normalcy like a stack of plates I could no longer carry, and I said, "Forged what?" Because my brain couldn't wrap itself around the idea that the people I had grown up trusting, despite everything, despite how they'd treated me, could cross the line from neglect into deception. She took a shaky breath. The estate papers. The version I signed was not the one in the official filing. And in that moment, something clicked, something electric, primal, like when you suddenly understand the shape of your own betrayal, not just feel it, but see it, and the nausea hit me like a punch. Because this wasn't just exclusion, it wasn't just favoritism or quiet cruelty. It was theft, calculated, deliberate theft, and they had done it under the guise of family, under the pretense of legality, using trust as their camouflage. "I want you to see it for yourself," she said. "I'm sending you the original draft. Compare it to what they filed." The envelope came the next morning, handwritten address, no return label, tucked neatly inside with a note in Grandma's delicate cursive. "This is the version I reviewed and signed on the 10th of February. Look at section 6. And I did. And what I found made my hands tremble, because clear as daylight, in the version she signed, I had equal authority with Elliot, co-executor, equal say, access to financial decisions, with a clause that ensured no unilateral changes could be made without my knowledge. In the version filed with the county, all of that was gone. Replaced with language that made Elliot sole decision-maker, citing technical complications and simplified execution strategy, with my name appearing only once as a consulting party in limited matters. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I called Clara and told her everything, every awful detail, and she didn't speak for a full minute before saying, "You need a lawyer." now. And I did. I found one Rebecca Hartman, a woman with a steel spine and a mind like a scalpel, who listened without blinking and then said, "We're going to file an injunction. But we'll need proof, not just signatures, but dates, metadata, a paper trail." So we dug. And the more we uncovered, the uglier it got. Emails from Elliot to my father discussing Grandma's cognitive decline in language clearly meant to establish doubt about her decision-making. Even though she was still living independently, still making sharp, pointed jokes about city planning meetings, still reading 3 newspapers every morning. Calendar invites for private notary sessions that were never disclosed to her. And most damning of all, a PDF edit timestamp that predated her signature but postdated the content change, meaning someone had revised the document after she signed and passed it off as the original. I remember staring at that timestamp, the cold, unfeeling digits on the screen, and thinking, this is how they do it. This is how people like them get away with it, not with brute force, but with silence, with confidence, with just enough ambiguity to make the truth look like bitterness and the victim look like the problem. But not this time. Because I was done being quiet. Rebecca drafted a legal letter that made my hands shake just reading it, every sentence clear, precise, devastating, and we served it to Elliot, my father, and their lawyer via certified mail and email, alongside our request for mediation. And that's when the reaction came. At first, it was confusion. Then, fury. My mother called, sobbing, asking how I could do this to the family, telling me I was ruining everything with my accusations, that Elliot had only ever wanted to protect Grandma, that I was being dramatic, vindictive, selfish. I let her speak. And then, with all the steadiness I could muster, I said, what he did is illegal. What Dad allowed is unethical. This is not a disagreement, it's fraud, and I won't let it go. She hung up, and I didn't call her back. Because for the first time, I didn't care if she thought I was a disappointment. I cared that I was doing what was right. The mediation was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, word spread. Cousin Ben emailed me quietly. I always thought something was off. Let me know if you need someone to testify about how lucid Grandma's been. I've got receipts. Maggie sent me a voice note. I know it's messy, but I'm proud of you. I'm staying out of it publicly, but I'm watching. And I see you. And, Grandma? She sat across from me at the dining table the night before the hearing, her hand resting on mine, eyes wet but clear, and she said, I'm not scared anymore. I thought I had to protect them from embarrassment, but I forgot I had to protect you too. I'm sorry for that. I squeezed her hand. It's not your fault, I whispered. But I could tell she didn't fully believe it. So I repeated it, softer, until she nodded. The next morning, we walked into that hearing not as victims, not as vengeful, but as people who had been quiet too long. And as I sat at that long table, across from the people who had tried to erase me with a stroke of a pen and a lie wrapped in civility, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was not alone anymore. And I was not going to let them win. It's one thing to suspect betrayal in the shadows of your own thoughts, to carry the weight of doubt like a coat that never quite dries. But it's another thing entirely to walk into a room filled with the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally, only to realize they've been building a scaffolding of lies so elaborate, so deliberate, that they now believe it themselves. And that's what I saw when I walked into the conference room where the mediation was being held. My heart pounding like a drum inside a cage, my breath shallow, hands cold despite the heat rushing to my face, because across from me sat my father and Elliot, both in tailored suits, both wearing expressions that didn't match the gravity of what they had done. The room was sterile, impersonal, all gray carpet and frosted glass, but it might as well have been a courtroom, because everything that mattered, our dignity, our history, our truth, was about to be laid bare. Grandma sat beside me, her fingers tight around mine, and Rebecca stood at the head of the table, every line of her suit crisp, every word she spoke weighted with precision. And when she began to walk through the timeline of the forged document, the mismatched dates, the digital fingerprints left in PDF metadata, The emails referencing decision authority and contingency clauses before Grandma had ever even read a draft. The room grew still, not with shock, but with the kind of tension that comes when everyone knows what's about to happen and can't pretend anymore that it might be avoided. My father shifted in his seat, adjusted his tie, and said, "I believe this is being blown out of proportion." Ruth was aware of the changes. "We simply clarified language to make execution easier." "Clarified?" Rebecca said, arching an eyebrow. "You removed a co-executor, altered disbursement structures, and revoked access to financial oversight, all without the grantor's knowledge or signature on the revised version. That's not clarification. That's fraud." Elliot exhaled loudly, as if he were tired, as if we were wasting his time. "Can we be honest?" he said, looking directly at me now for the first time in weeks. "Melissa, you've always been emotional. And I don't mean that as an insult, I just mean you take things personally. You assume the worst. But the truth is, this wasn't some conspiracy. It was practical. Grandma's finances are complex. You're not a financial expert. Neither are you." I shot back, my voice sharp, rising with a heat I hadn't expected. "But that didn't stop you from stripping me out of her legacy. From rewriting history with your keystrokes and your smug sense of entitlement." "Enough," Grandma said then, voice low but firm, the tremor in her words not from fear but fury. "I am not confused. I am not senile. And I did not consent to what you filed." The mediatora soft-spoken woman named Darian nodded and tapped her pen against the table. "Let's clarify, for the record, that Miss Sharp has signed an affidavit stating that the version of the trust filed with the court is not the one she approved." "Yes," Rebecca said. "And we have evidence that the version submitted was created using editing software after the original was signed. The timestamped file names do not align with any communication that included Miss Sharp." Dad's voice turned flat, clinical. "The intention was never to deceive. We just didn't want to burden Ruth with paperwork." Grandma turned to him. "Burden me? I've been managing my own books since I was 17. I ran a school. I wrote our family budget by hand for 20 years. Don't insult me by pretending you were doing me a favor. You knew what you were doing, you just didn't think anyone would call you on it." Elliot's mask cracked then, just slightly. "You've always favored her," he muttered, not looking at Grandma now but at me, his voice hardening. "Even when she was flailing through school, when she couldn't hold down a job, when she bounced between startups like a tourist. You always made excuses for her. I've been consistent, I've delivered. And somehow, I'm the villain." "You are," I said. "Because you built your success on other people's silence." He scoffed. "I worked for everything I have. And you couldn't stand it when I started to have something of my own," I said. "So you took this. You knew they'd believe you. You knew I'd hesitate. You knew I wouldn't fight back." He didn't deny it. And that, more than anything he'd said, confirmed it all. My father folded his hands, but I could see his knuckles go white. "I tried to protect the family from internal conflict," he said. "That's all this ever was." "No," Rebecca said calmly. "This was about control." And then she pulled out the final piece. An email Elliot had sent to their attorney we'd uncovered through a subpoena request that was granted just 3 days before the mediation. It read, "If Melissa pushes back, we'll play the over-emotional card. If we position this as us helping Ruth simplify, we can still get full control before the fiscal year closes. She'll give in once she realizes we're not budging. She always folds." The room went dead. Even the air seemed to still. Grandma's hand slipped from mine. "Is that true?" she asked, her voice now nothing but steel. Elliot didn't speak. My father closed his eyes. That was the moment. The moment the truth shattered the performance. The moment all of it, the lies, the manipulation, the calculated betrayal came undone. And for the first time, I saw fear in Elliot's eyes. Not fear of me, not fear of being wrong, but fear of being exposed. Fear that the image he'd cultivated, the family favorite, the responsible heir, the business genius, was now scorched under the harsh light of reality. Daria took a breath and spoke into the stillness. Given the presented evidence and the clear contradiction in intent versus execution, this case will move to formal investigation unless a settlement is reached and the original version of the trust is reinstated with both named co-executors and full transparency. That is non-negotiable. Elliot finally broke. Fine, he muttered. Reinstate it. I don't care anymore. Yes, you do, I said. You just didn't expect to get caught. We left the room in silence. But it was a different silence. It wasn't fog anymore. It was aftermath. And I knew, as I held Grandma's hand, that everything had changed. Not because I'd won, but because I had chosen not to fold. Not this time. In the weeks that followed the mediation, the silence from my family stretched longer than it ever had before. But this time, it wasn't the kind that gnawed at me with doubt or made me feel invisible instead. It felt like the kind of silence that comes after a storm has finally passed. The kind that lingers in a house where windows have been cracked open and the air has shifted, fresh and unsettled. Still tinged with the scent of rain and something else, something cleaner, maybe even freedom. The trust was reinstated, exactly as Grandma had intended. Rebecca made sure of it. I was named co-executor again, with full oversight, and every clause that had been stripped from the original version was returned. Every legal maneuver that Elliot and my father had buried inside vague language and assumed power was reversed under legal scrutiny, and though they tried to resist, tried to salvage some part of their image, it was too late because you can't unring a bell, and once the truth has been spoken, it has a way of echoing through every hallway where secrets were once kept safe. And it wasn't just about the trust anymore. There was a shift I felt, not loud, but steady, in the way people around us looked at me, especially those who had once sided with convenience, with silence, with the belief that being difficult was worse than being disrespected. Maggie invited me to speak on a virtual panel about ethical leadership in tech. Ben shared my case study on LinkedIn with a caption that read, "Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let someone else write your story." Even Clara, who had stood by me through everything, started calling me battle-tested, half joking, half reverent. But the biggest shift came from Grandma Ruth. She began including me in every financial decision, every estate planning call, every conversation with lawyers or advisors, not just out of fairness, but because she trusted me, and not in a ceremonial way. Not like I was a name on a piece of paper, but in the day-to-day choices, the hard, real work that comes with managing a legacy. One morning, we sat in her sunroom, sipping coffee, her hair in loose curls, her robe neatly pressed, and she looked at me with that quiet fire still glowing behind her aging eyes. "You know," she said, "I always knew you were strong, but I didn't realize how much they feared it." "He blinked," she continued. "That's why they did it. Not because you were weak, but because you were the only one they couldn't control with guilt or charm or silence. And now they know it, too." Oh, I wanted to cry then, not because I was sad, but because I finally felt seen. And as for Elliot and my father, they didn't face criminal charges. Rebecca explained that without proof of intent to defraud beyond the document discrepancy, the court wouldn't pursue them criminally. Not unless we wanted to initiate a civil lawsuit, but the damage was already done, not in courtrooms, but in the family itself. The trust they had abused the humankind, not just the legal document, was broken. They became pariahs in our small circle of extended family, not because I turned anyone against them, but because people saw the truth and couldn't unsee it. They stopped being the heroes of the Sharp family myth. They became cautionary tales. And I didn't need revenge. I didn't need them to fall. It was enough to know I had risen. It was enough to sit beside my grandmother, at the same table where Elliot once smirked and belittled me, and help her review the charitable grants we were now coordinating in her name, grants. I was helping design for tech education programs for underrepresented girls, for UX advocacy, for accessibility. It was enough to watch her eyes light up when she said, "I'm proud of you, honey." And no, she meant every syllable, no strings, no performance. And on a quiet afternoon, while I was organizing files in her office, I found a letter tucked into the back of her desk drawer, addressed to me, dated just a week after that awful Easter dinner. I opened it with trembling hands and read, Melissa, if you're reading this, it means the truth came out, one way or another. I want you to know I've always seen you, even when the others didn't. You have a light that doesn't blind people, it warms them. That's why they tried to dim it. But don't let them, ever. Love, Grandma Ruth. I folded the letter and held it to my chest. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was fighting for recognition. I had it. And more importantly, I had reclaimed myself. The quiet that came after everything settled wasn't the same heavy silence that used to fill the corners of my life. Wasn't the cold absence of approval or the echo of footsteps walking away. It was different now, softer. Still, almost sacred, like the kind of silence that comes when you finally put down the weight you didn't know you'd been carrying for years and realize, with aching clarity, that it's possible to be light again. I moved to a new apartment, not because I had to, but because I wanted to start over in a space that didn't carry the echoes of long nights spent doubting myself, crying beside spreadsheets and severance emails, or shrinking into corners during phone calls with people who refused to hear me. This new place had tall windows and a balcony that overlooked a line of trees, and every morning I'd make tea and stand there barefoot, letting the wind kiss my face like it was congratulating me for simply surviving. I wasn't making millions, wasn't founding companies or headlining conferences, but I was working again freelance projects at first, consulting roles with nonprofits who cared more about impact than polish, and eventually, a full-time offer from a startup that reached out after reading my case study and said, "We want someone who's not afraid to speak the hard truths," and I knew, right then, that I would never again settle for a job or a family that expected me to keep my head down in exchange for love or legitimacy. Grandma Ruth and I still talked every day, and every Sunday we had tea at her place, our own ritual of rebuilding, where we talked about everything and nothing about the weather, the neighbors, the ridiculous things politicians were doing, but always, tucked inside her words, was that look, that glow of pride that said, "You did it," and I'd smile, because I knew now that I didn't have to keep proving myself, not to her, and not to anyone else who needed titles to believe I mattered. As for the rest of the family, the relationships were different, not broken entirely, but changed in ways that no holiday meal or apology could completely repair, and I accepted that, not bitterly, but with a kind of peace, because I finally understood that some bridges were meant to stay crossed only once, and that loving people didn't always mean letting them back into the places where they had done the most damage. Elliot tried to reach out once, sent an email with an apology that read more like a resignation. Something about misunderstandings and pressures and "I never meant to hurt you," but I didn't respond. Not because I hated him, but because I no longer needed anything from him, not his apology, not his approval, not even his guilt. I had everything I needed. And on warm evenings, when I sat on the balcony with a glass of wine, watching the sky change colors like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be, I let the past be what it was, not a chain, not a burden, just a chapter I had lived and learned from. Freedom, I realized, isn't loud. It's quiet. It's honest. It's finally being able to say, "This is who I am," and no longer needing anyone else to agree. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, every betrayal, every small cruelty disguised as concern, every moment I sat alone wondering if I was the problem, it's that sometimes the hardest battle you'll ever fight is the one to believe in your own worth, when the people who are supposed to protect it are the very ones who chipped away at that kept it, day by day, until you begin to question whether there's anything left underneath the doubt, anything solid, anything true. But there always is. Because the truth, the one I had to fight like hell to uncover, is that worth isn't something your family gets to assign. It's not determined by titles or trust funds or whether your name is bolded in a will. It's not validated by applause or inheritance or the number of seats you're offered at someone else's table. Your worth is yours. It lives in the quiet defiance of getting up every time you've been told you don't belong. It lives in the work you do when no one is watching, in the boundaries you build to protect your peace, in the love you give even when it's not returned the way it should be, and, if you're lucky, you learn to stop asking small people to see a light they've trained themselves not to notice. It took me years, decades, maybe to understand that being excluded was never about me being unworthy. It was about them being too afraid to face the parts of me they couldn't control. I spent so long believing that if I just did more, achieved more, proved myself harder, they would eventually turn toward me with open arms and say, "Now we see you," but they never did, and now I understand why. Some people only recognize strength when it looks like power, and they miss the quiet resilience of someone who keeps showing up even when there's no spotlight, no praise, no audience clapping for them just because they stayed soft in a world that tried to harden them. And that's what I am: soft, yes, but strong. Not the kind of strong that wears armor and sharpens knives, but the kind that keeps loving even after being let down, that rebuilds after being broken, that refuses to shrink just to keep other people comfortable. There's something sacred in surviving people who try to define you in pieces and walking away with your whole self intact. And if you're someone reading this, someone who's felt like the black sheep, the invisible one, the family disappointment, the one who stayed too long hoping for change, then hear me now: you are not alone. And more importantly, you are not broken. You're not too much or not enough. You're not a burden or a background character or a footnote in someone else's story. You are the author of your own life, and sometimes the bravest thing you'll ever do is stop begging people to read your pages and start writing the story that makes you proud to live inside it. That's what I'm doing now. No longer performing. No longer asking to be seen. Just living. Fully. Freely. Finally.